This morning, as you've heard already forecasted by Pam, we have challenging matters to consider. Um, they are challenging, but I also hope that you'll hear an invitation this morning. If you can hang with me long enough, that there'll be an invitation that calls to your heart. Today, to see or not to see, that is the question. And I'm really grateful that Crosswalk is a community where seeing and hearing and doing hard things is just par for the course. We show up on Sunday and we expect um, to be challenged. We expect to be messed with. Dar said that I messed with the first service this morning, so I'll probably mess with you too. But that's okay because Pete does it all the time, so I have permission, right? And as Pam already shared with you, we're going to touch two of the chapters in our Following the Call book today. If you are reading that book along with us at home as we take this year-long journey through the Sermon on the Mount, you'll discover that today we're going to hit chapter 40 and chapter 41 because the verses go together. They belong together. So I hope you'll hang with me for that. I'm really excited about it because I get to share with you some of the resources and topics from the seminary class that I taught this summer. These are some of my favorite things to talk about, even though most church people don't like to talk about them at all. So I'm going to have a good time, at least this morning. And just so you know, before the end of the service or at the end of the service, following the teaching and before we pray to dismiss, we will be having communion. So just know that that is coming. All right. Okay. The first text that we're going to read this morning is Matthew 6, verses 22 and 23. The eye is the lamp of the body. Therefore, if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how terrible will that darkness be? Now, I don't know about you, but this is not a verse that I've ever spent a whole lot of time with. And at first, when you begin reading through the Sermon on the Mount, we just had this beautiful lesson last week about treasures on earth versus treasures in heaven. And we spent all of those weeks slowly going through the Lord's Prayer. And that was really, really beautiful. And then all of a sudden, we get this really weird verse about the eye that seems to just come out of nowhere. And those of you that came to Crosswalk from liturgical church settings, anybody grow up in a liturgical church or come from a liturgical church? There's a few hands out there. This is a text, the I text is a text that's not in the lectionary. So if you came through a liturgical church setting, this text about the I would have not been part of the preaching rotation. And the last two churches where I was were liturgical. So I've not spent a lot of time with this verse. So I had a lot of fun with it, thinking about it and connecting it to other things. And we're going to make connections not only to last week's teaching, but to the verses following it, and also to two different stories from Matthew 25, as well as a story from Matthew 26, because there are deep connections throughout the book of Matthew. So what's the I got to do with anything? And we won't be surprised because we talk about these things here all the time, but context and language matter. And since Pete has been relying a lot for praxis on the Barclay commentaries, I dug out my Barclay for this week. And it's really interesting to look at the language and word nuances with the whole good eye versus bad eye, healthy eye versus evil eye thing. And that's been touched on a little bit today. But that good eye, there are meaning nuances that do mean generous. So, a vision or a sight that sees God's abundance, that sees possibilities, that sees opportunities, a way of seeing that leads to life, right? A way of seeing that allows a person to move through the world as a conduit of generosity, having a good eye. Well, a bad eye, by definition and original word meaning, is a grudging eye, which I've never thought a whole lot about. But a grudging eye, I love how Pam used the word stingy because it's perfect. A person with a grudging eye, a bad eye, an evil eye, sees the world through a lens of scarcity. There's never enough of anything. So we have to hold on to our stuff because there's not enough to go around. Not only that, but a person with an evil eye or a bad eye might look upon the stuff of others and desire it in ways that are unhealthy, or perhaps even wish harm to people that have the stuff that they want, if that makes sense to you. If you're familiar with Eastern religions or some Eastern cultures, the concept of the evil eye is prevalent in some places. Has anybody traveled anywhere or studied about cultures that have superstitions around the evil eye? That wear amulets or hang trinkets around their house that look like eyes, to ward off the evil eye so that no harm will come to them and their own abundance because of someone else's evil eye, stingy eye, grudging eye. It's fascinating. But this resonates with folks for whom that concept is familiar and prevalent. So that's what the eye has to do with anything. And of course, it's deeply connected to the verses that immediately follow it. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be loyal to the one and have contempt for the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. That's the Common English Bible. And of course, I put the other words up there that are present in other translations. Money, sometimes used. Mammon. And mammon is often capitalized when it's used in this verse in some translations. And like it was alluded to earlier, mammon is money, but more, if you will. We see it capitalized as a way of personifying wealth, giving it the character of a person or a god with a formal name. And so if you see your translation say mammon, that's what it's talking about. Money to a different degree, to the degree of godhood, if you will. And we shouldn't be surprised that both of these texts this week connect us to last week, right? Where we heard Pete talk about how we as people will follow the force in our life that we most treasure. And we'll either follow the force, the Spirit of God that leads to life, a rich, full, abundant life, or we will follow some other force that does not lead to that type of full life, if you will. Because where our treasure is, our heart will be there also, right? So here's the connection between our two texts today. Wealth, or money, or mammon, whichever term you prefer to use, blinds us to truths right in front of our eyes. Whether that is the truth of God's abundance or some other truth. But these things, especially when elevated to the level of godhood, if you will, priority, passion, they cloud our vision. They make it difficult for us to see clearly, for us to see the world clearly, for us to see our neighbors clearly, and I would argue even for us to see our own selves clearly. It's probably a good time to remind ourselves again, like we do every week, that the Bible was not written in an American context or to an American context for that matter, nor was it written through a capitalistic perspective, right? And we live and swim and breathe in American capitalism all the time. So we bring it to the text when we read it, but it wasn't there ahead of us. So that's another thing that kind of can get in our way and blind us to the truth. These systems that we are swimming in. And so it's good to acknowledge that today. It's important to acknowledge it today because of where I'm going to take us over the next little bit. We're not going to go too deeply into it, but scholars actually disagree about how we ought to view wealth and money. Some scholars might say that there is such a thing as honest wealth. You can earn your wealth and amass wealth in honest ways. You can use it for good purposes and that redeems it, things like that. But there are other biblical scholars and interpreters that would argue that in the time of Jesus, so then we need to listen to it too, that in the time of Jesus, the perspective of those folks that Jesus was talking to was quite the opposite. That you actually cannot amass wealth without exploiting people, perhaps exploiting the earth too, but particularly people. Remember that Jesus is largely surrounded by peasants, right? Who were being exploited by the Romans, right? And so their perspective on wealth is very different than what ours might be. And so it's good also to acknowledge that because those things matter as we read and as we study. And I'll also say I acknowledge that speaking those words in an American church is never very popular. But here we are. So let's look at our following the call quote today. Well, I could have brought something, long and maybe deep and profound. I decided to go with direct instead. Chapter 40 in the book that we're following this year, Timothy Keller wrote the only essay in that chapter. It's 4 or 5 pages long. And this is kind of the most direct, I think, simplistic, and at the same time, I think there is depth here. Materialism has the power to blind you to materialism. So not only does wealth or money or mammon or materialism, blind us to things kind of out here, if you will, can also blind us even to our own proclivities, if you will, to the ways in which we behave, to what we love, what we put our trust in. So essentially, the bad eye distorts the way we see out there and the way we see in here. It's a lot to think about. It's very challenging to think about in our context, in our day. As I continue this morning, I'll tell you that I might slip into substituting other words even for the for the wealth word, I began to be challenged and to think about how privilege probably fits there too, because privilege is often tied to financial resources, socioeconomic status. It can be tied to gender, it can be tied to education, race, or culture, and all of those things kind of together can cloud our vision. So this morning is an invitation to see things differently, or to see things from another perspective, to see and not be afraid to look away from topics that are hard, or from scholars who bring us something different. So I was reflecting this week, and I was asking myself, or I've been reflecting for a few weeks, and been asking myself this question. And yes, it's supposed to be like that. So what are some things that we fail to see or do not see clearly? You just reflect on that. I thought about having us shout them out, but changed my mind. So just something to think about in your own life. Where does your own success or privilege, wealth, your station in life, however you want to call that, where are there blind spots? Or where have you discovered opportunities to see more clearly? It's a good thing, I think, for us to think about. This morning, I'm going to bring two topics where I have begun to see more clearly in my own life. And that's why I bring them. And I hope that they can serve as an invitation to you um, to maybe think about them from different perspectives, perhaps see them through new eyes, if you will. Both of the topics that I'm going to share about are frequent topics in public and political and religious discourse. They will not be new topics to you. They were big topics in the seminary class that I taught this summer, and they stimulated a lot of discussion. Perhaps we'll have some discussion in the coming weeks in smaller groups as we begin to think about these things. The first topic I bring is the topic of poverty. Now, I've brought this scholar who's on the screen right now to you before, but I want to introduce her more fully today and talk a little bit about her work in biblical interpretation. So the book on the screen is called Always With Us, ? Always With Us? What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. And it was written by Dr. Liz Theo Harris. Liz is a clergy person. She's a scholar. She's an activist, a community organizer. She founded the the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, and she's the co-chair of the national movement of the Poor People's Campaign, which is a reinvention of the Poor People's Campaign that MLK launched in the late 60s. One of her notable contributions that's really, really impacting me in this season is her writing and teaching a biblical hermeneutic. You've heard that word used in this space before, a biblical hermeneutic, or an interpretive lens for reading the Bible through the eyes of the poor. Not to the poor, not at the poor, but through the eyes of the poor. And so this book contains lots of quotes from poor people who have read the Bible and said, I see myself here, or I see myself here, or homeless who have said, oh my gosh, like Jesus was homeless like me. And she's devoted her scholarship to writing and teaching people how to read the Bible through that type of lens. It requires a new way of seeing. for many of us. It's a very challenging and potentially life-changing book. It's all based on the interpretation of one particular text, Matthew 26:11, that is partially quoted here, and I will fully quote it here in just a minute. So this is a quote from Liz. The poor you will always have with you is actually one of the strongest statements of the biblical mandate to end poverty. Do y'all recognize the part in quotations? Do you recognize that excerpt from Matthew 26:11? Matthew 26:11 in its fullness reads, this is the voice of Jesus, you always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. I'll talk about the broader context of that in just a minute. But I don't know about you all, but in my kind of traditional church upbringing, this statement from Matthew 26, these words of Jesus were used as a factual statement for why the church couldn't do anything to end poverty. Jesus said there's always going to be poor people. That's what he said. We can't do anything about it. That's what Jesus said. There's always going to be poor people. And Liz says, no, that actually when he says that, that's not what he means. That he means something radical. And reading the way she interprets scripture, like I said, is beginning to be life-changing for me. I'm not good at it yet. I'm trying to get good at it yet. So this scene from Matthew 26:11, where that saying of Jesus comes from, is at a dinner in Bethany, which was a community outside of Jerusalem, so away from the seats of power, away from the temple and other governmental seats of power. So it's outside and away from any power structures, okay? The name Bethany, the name of the community, translated means house of the poor. Bethany means house of the poor. And Jesus is dining at a dinner at Simon the leper's home. And those of us that remember what the Bible teaches about people with leprosy know that they're outcasts, right? You know, people aren't supposed to touch them, not supposed to eat with them. They're unclean. And that also means probably poor, because they'd be limited in the ways they would have been able to earn a living, etc., because of not being able to be around people. So this scene where Jesus makes this statement is at a dinner in a town that means house of the poor, at a poor person who's been ostracized by his community. And do you remember what he says it in response to? What has just happened? A woman who is unnamed in the Gospel of Matthew opens a very, very expensive jar of perfume or ointment in some translations and anoints Jesus with it. And the people in the room have a fit. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Look at all that she's wasted. Look at all that money she wasted by pouring that perfume on you. We could have used that to feed the poor. And Jesus says, you always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. That's his response to their bad eyes, their stingy eyes, right? So Dr. Theo Harris looks at this text, and this is something she says, echoing Deuteronomy 15:4, which reads, however, there need be no poor among you. Matthew 26:11 is to be read as a warning, not a statement of fact, a warning about the perils of disobedience to God's commandments, which result in poverty and inequality. And Jesus' call to the disciples to take up the struggle for justice for the poor, even after his death. So she ties this text in Deuteronomy, which is part of a larger selection of the Old Testament that include God's commands for Sabbath days, sabbatical years, and Jubilee. These patterns of rest, these patterns of release, forgiving of debts, releasing slaves, returning property to the original owner. Those were God's original prescriptions for dealing with these human issues, so that people wouldn't remain in generation after generation of poverty, but that every so often those cycles would be broken and people would get a fresh start. She's tying that text to this statement. And she writes, an unnamed prophetess anoints Jesus to be ruler of God's kingdom, and his charge is to care for all, especially the poor. It's also worth mentioning, because I told you I wanted to connect these things, that the story of the anointing comes right after Jesus has told a story about what we call the judgment of the nations, where the king comes and separates the sheep from the goats. Do you all know that text where the sheep are welcomed into the kingdom because they fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, visited the prisoners, etc. And the goats are sent away because they didn't do any of those things. We'll do some more connecting about that in a few minutes. But there are connections all through the book of Matthew that weave these themes together, that connect with our text today. Just a new way of seeing. The second hard topic that I brought this morning is even newer to me than trying to read the Bible with the poor. But this book just came out this year. And I used it with my seminary class because I'm always looking for new resources about the Bible and money. So Dr. Malcolm Foley, who's a professor at Baylor, I wonder if she knows our own Jenny Matheny. I'll have to ask her. The anti-greed gospel, why the love of money is the root of racism and how the church can create a new way forward. Dr. Foley makes the case in his book that the insidiousness of greed has blinded us to the truth about racism. He says, racism is not about hate and ignorance. It's about greed, and it always has been. I don't know if you're like me. Maybe you're a lot farther along on the journey, but racism has always really tripped me up and frustrated me as a Christian. I couldn't understand racist Christians. How could they be so hateful? How could they be so ignorant? And then to read his book and this take on racism is very interesting. He uses the verse about God and mammon as the foundational verse for the entire book. So he repeats it over and over again as he lays out kind of the history of racism in the United States. This book is an excellent work of history and Christian ethics if you're a reader and you're interested in those things. I will say that Foley's theological framework is not like that of Crosswalk. So if you read it, just be prepared. He's a Reformed theologian. He's not an open and relational process theology person. He's a historian, which is why he wrote a work of history and ethics. So it's very thought-provoking to think about how an anti-racist church, which I think generally we consider ourselves to be an anti-racist church, must also be an anti-greed church. And he's helping me see things that I only had limited vision for before. In the first part of his book, he does the history thing, and he traces the history of slavery, the lynching era, the Jim Crow era, and more. And he does it all through the lens of greed, repeatedly, like I said, drawing on the text. You cannot serve both God and mammon. And he talks about how it wasn't racism that motivated our ancestors, to steal property and human bodies, or to use lynching as a means of getting blacks to move to other communities, or to leverage Jim Crow laws to limit economic power, but actually that it was greed that motivated all of those things, and that the concept of race and racism arose out of a situation that was already um, swimming in greed, which is it is an interesting flip, I think, and very challenging to read and to think about. In the second part of the book, he addresses the church. So places like ours that, wants the world to be different, doesn't want the world to be a racist world. And he offers some really good suggestions about how the church, the local church, can reframe itself and even think about ways it can get involved in changing systems that are racist, that are not equitable in our own communities. It's really good stuff. It's a lot to think about. And of course, if you haven't already made them in your own head, I brought poverty and racism this morning to talk about. And of course, they're connected, right? We know this. Just this week, the Cairo Center put out a report that included all of the 2024 poverty statistics. And so I was reading that report as I was prepping. And some of the things were really staggering to me, and I want to share them with you. You may already know. They may not be staggering to you, but some of them were staggering to me. According to the latest data from 2024, 41.4% of Americans are poor or low income. 41.4%, roughly 140 million people. 2 in 5 Americans are either unable to make ends meet or are just one emergency away from poverty. Here's the big one that really got me in the heart. California. Maybe you already know this. California is tied with Mississippi, of all places, at the top of the list of the states for having 50% population at or below the level of poverty. I never could imagine a world where California would rank the same as Mississippi on a list like that. If you're from Mississippi, I apologize to you. Mississippi's lovely. It was very surprising to me to think about that right here in our beautiful, beautiful, beautiful backyard, our neighbors are represented by these statistics. So Dr. Theo Harris and Dr. Foley both put forth ideas for how the church can be involved in organized movements that transform oppressive systems, that keep people poor, that make people poor and keep people poor. And in the cases of both poverty and racism, it will take a whole lot of us to see things differently and to be willing to envision something new. If 41.4% of Americans would mobilize, MLK talked about that in the 60s, that when people who've got nothing to lose decide to take action, that's when something will happen, right? But I think it will also take some of us who do have something to lose to join them in movements to change our country, both around poverty and around racism. But I'll tell you what, I believe it's possible. I believe it with all my heart that it's possible. Because when we're together, I catch little glimpses of possibility. When I'm with other people who are also excited by things like this, I see glimpses of possibility. And there was this quote in Dr. Foley's book that I want to bring to you that really resonated with me. I've been thinking about it And I had to share it with you. And it's also inspired me to think about a new spiritual practice that I'm going to invite you to before we dismiss today, or before we leave this time. Love, this is Malcolm Foley, who wrote that book about the anti-greed gospel. Love is best understood fundamentally and inextricably as material investment in one's neighbor. I can't get that out of my head. I can't. And so I've been thinking about, like, what can I do with that? And this is where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with a new spiritual practice. And like I said, I want to invite you to that. I know that a lot of people check their portfolios at the end of the day, see how the markets did, right? To see how their retirement accounts look, or their everyday investments. I don't know anything about that. So I was wondering, like, how our sight might improve, how we might get clearer vision if we replace the market as a measure of our worth and wealth. And instead, I wonder what would happen if at the end of each day, we would ask ourselves this question: how have I invested in my neighbor? Or how have I invested in a world where it's possible that racism and poverty might be eradicated? How have I invested in my neighbor? This is my guess. We'll see. I'm going to try it quietly on my own. I invite you to try it quietly on your own, and maybe we'll discover in a few months something. But my guess is that our vision of ourselves, of our neighbors, and maybe even our world would grow clearer. That's my hope. I pray that it is so.